Oh, hey, it's you again. I'm glad you made it out of that volcano. That must have been a tough climb. I'm Josh Crowley, in case you forgot, or if you're watching a pirated version of this video. Our political system sucks dog ass through a garden hose. Garden hose full of smaller asses. Maybe mouse asses, or bug asses. Do bugs have asses? Nope. We've all heard of the Electoral College. You know, that thing everyone gets mad about every 4 years and then nobody does anything about. Well, here's a fun fact for you. There have been no Republican presidents who've won without the Electoral College since 1988. George Bush Sr. was the last one, and that was against Dukakis. To put this into perspective, there hasn't been a Republican president who's won the popular vote since 5 years after Return of the Jedi came out. There have been like, what, 41 Star Wars movies since then? Okay, George W. Bush won re-election with the popular vote, but he'd never have been incumbent in the first place without the Electoral College is my point. And that time he was running against Frankenstein's monsters, so that kind of skewed the odds in his favor a little bit. Anyway, what a way to run a rodeo. It's a pretty shitty system, and it's no wonder people feel alienated and marginalized, as if their votes don't count. But the Electoral College is only one of the many ways our federal government disenfranchises voters. Did you know that the Senate gives nearly 70 times as much power to the people of Wyoming than the people of California? I know this is oversimplifying things a little, but at average housing market rates in Wyoming, Jeff Bezos could buy every home in the state and have 2 senators all to himself and still be a multi-billionaire. Well, every home but 2. The excuse for things like the Electoral College in the Senate is always something like, well, we need to make sure that city folk don't ignore or override the interests of rural folk. On the surface, that sounds like a noble sentiment, but I have a few concerns with it. 1, it still gives an advantage based on amount of land owned. 2, what interests are so important that it requires giving almost 70 times as much power to one state versus another? And for that matter, conversely, what interests are so unimportant that it requires giving around 1/70th as much power to one state versus another? Why are the interests and needs of Californians worth so much less than the needs of Wyomingans? Wyomingites? Wyominglers? Wyombres? Here's the thing, it's 2020. We all have the internet and it only takes like 7 hours to fly from coast to coast. On the whole, nobody's needs and interests are that different from one state to the next. It's not like people in New York City are so ignorant and inconsiderate about how the world works that they're gonna, I don't know, ban farms or something. In fact, maybe if people from cities weren't given only a tiny fraction of the power they should have, we'd have a government that would stop companies like Monsanto from screwing over farmers. Rural areas tend in general to vote for Republicans. That's not to say that everyone in those areas votes the same way, by the way. Liberals do this thing where they separate people into red states and blue states, and they go, look at all these dummies in the red states, as if everyone living in a geographical region has homogenous values and philosophies and principles and thoughts. But even then, just because people vote against their own interests, it doesn't mean they deserve to suffer or be ridiculed. Anyway, since people's needs are largely homogenous countrywide in this era of booming globalization and fast transport, we're effectively giving power multipliers not to rural needs, but to Republican values. Think for a moment about what those might be. Harsher immigration policies fueled by xenophobia, control over women's bodies, tormenting and oppressing LGBTQ+ folks, a so-called Christian agenda that loathes the poor and marginalized, worsening the distribution of wealth while millions go without health care. Just cruel and ignorant policies all around. Policies I really don't think deserve protecting from city folk using power multipliers. The Senate is geographically partitioned in such a way that there's likely to be more Republicans and Democrats simply because we empower more rural areas which tend to vote for conservatives. And let's not forget about the House. Thanks to the Permanent Apportionment Act of 1929, try saying that 5 times fast. Permanent Apportionment Act, Permanent Apportionment. The number of representatives has been capped at 435 regardless of population changes. The distribution gets adjusted about every 10 years or so, but thanks to the geometrical contortions of gerrymandering, it's resulted in unfairly boosted Republican power. I've summoned a card for you to click up top to go to a video on how gerrymandering works and why it can result in unrepresentative government. It hasn't always benefited the Republicans, and it could just as easily benefit the Democrats, but at present, for the last few decades, that's the direction it's gone. And as you amass power, you can change things to prevent your opponents from balancing things out. You're probably already aware of a lot of this. I'm certainly not the only person talking about how the Electoral College and the Senate and gerrymandering in the House skew the balance of power in favor of conservatives. But there are some some other ways that conservative views and values have an unfair advantage in our government. In order to run for president, you have to be 35 years old. For senators, the minimum is 30, and for representatives, it's 25. Younger people tend to have significantly more progressive views than their predecessors, and yet the only power they have is to vote and campaign for older people who don't necessarily fully reflect their values. Young people today have grown up in a world that's given them the sum and total of all human knowledge at their fingertips. They can witness world events happening in real time from the perspectives of people living through them. They communicate instantaneously with people around the globe using technology that previous generations could only dream of. But until they reach 30, they're locked out of the Senate. And until they reach 35, they're locked out of the presidency. I strongly believe that you should be able to vote and run for office as early as you're required to pay taxes. If some 18-year-old convinces enough people that they're the best candidate for the Senate, then what the fuck is the problem? We don't have age maximums, so why do we have age minimums? People decry ageism whenever anyone suggests that old people shouldn't be allowed to run for office, and yet they all seem fine with the ageism already present in the system. Besides, what did age minimums truly protect us from? There are almost certainly thousands of teens and 20-somethings who do a far better job than the smooth-brained trash goblin we've currently got. And the thing is, when those older people do get into office, they tend to stay a while. There are no limits on how many terms you can serve in the Senate or the House. Statistically, incumbents tend to win re-election, so it's a steeply uphill battle for younger people trying to rise through the ranks to see their values and ideals reflected in government. Even worse, the Supreme Court doesn't have terms at all, and its members tend not to retire until they're either dead or extremely senescent. So it can be decades or even generations before the values of people in their 20s or 30s are finally reflected in that branch of our government. And even then, they have to be filtered through an executive branch that itself has multiple power multipliers that stifle progressivism. Is it any wonder the Overton window keeps sliding toward the right and that we have to fight so fucking hard to push it in the other direction? And is it any wonder that Democrats are constantly pitching toward their right, considering we've given so much power to conservatives? So how do we fix this? Well, for starters, we can get rid of the Electoral College and use a popular vote, preferably with ranked choice voting to give more of a voice to third-party candidates. Then we can undo gerrymandering by imposing strict geometrical limitations on the shapes of congressional districts and reproportion representatives accordingly. Reproportion representatives accordingly. Reproportion representatives accordingly. After that, we can either abolish the Senate or make it some sort of population proportionate upper house. Somewhere in there, we should reduce the age minimums for holding office down to the voting age. And then we should add some term limits for both Congress and the Supreme Court. Combine all that with campaign finance reform and we'll have a far, far more balanced government within a decade. One that fairly and equally represents us. And that's exactly why we won't do any of it. Anyway, if you enjoy my content, please subscribe and recommend it to your friends. If you hate it, please recommend it to your enemies. Thank you very much for watching. We all have limited moments on this planet, and I appreciate that you chose to spend some with me. Until next time, be seeing you. It's like my 8th glass of water so far today. Every 4 years, and then nobody does it. George Bush. But even then, just because people vote against, effectively giving multipliers. Is it? Yeah, proportion.